I want to welcome everybody back. The second of our third presentation this weekend. So just want to do a brief review of what we discussed yesterday. So before I do that, I'd like to ask maybe a few of you what you remember of yesterday, and either how it made you feel. I guess more of a testimony as opposed to the facts and figures. Who had the Christine? Yeah.
We were discussing. Roberts, I'm sorry. I can tell you how I didn't feel. I started feeling like I was thinking, is it me? Is it me that's sitting here and I don't belong here? I started questioning myself.
So I posted the title of yesterday's presentation, and it was based upon a comment that I made during the study. And it's, I think, along the lines, the enemy within the gate. And it sounds quite accusatory. And Christine was saying that it made her, or it forced her to examine herself to see if she was that person. Sorry, did you want to say anything else, Christine? No? Okay. Anyone else? Nobody? I'll ask somebody if somebody wants to volunteer. Oh, Kathy.
Basically the same. I can't know.
It's fine.
Oh. Well, I had me really reflecting again, like Christine said, mainly I was like praying, or please don't let it be me, I don't want to be.
1 second. So Kathy said that she had similar thoughts to Christine. And she was praying that, speaking to the Lord, communicating with the Lord, to say that she didn't want that person to be her, or she didn't want to be that person. Okay. Victoria. So Victoria had similar thoughts to both Christine and Kathy.
My thoughts are long, and I don't know how to shorten it. So
Got it.
my thoughts are long, and I don't know how to convince it. I wrote how it made me feel because I was meditating a lot upon it, but I don't know how to convince it for you.
So Victoria says that she had similar thoughts, but she doesn't quite know how to put those thoughts, those feelings, succinctly in words. And to be honest, I think I feel the same way. That it really made me wonder, am I in the faith? Am I kidding myself? And someone messaged me, and in their message, they focused on the point about Noah's children, Noah's sons. Because that story obviously focuses upon the sins of the men. And we spoke about that idea yesterday, about, at a very simple level, that sinners enter into the new world. The new earth. And I don't know what individuals think that means. If they think that open sinners are going to be able to enter into heaven or not. But the point that I wanted to get from that, without giving a definitive answer, was that those men didn't suddenly turn bad after the flood. They took what we see in the new earth is a manifestation of the baggage that they were carrying with them in the old earth. I'm not trying to suggest that open sinners, practicing sinners, will enter heaven. That wasn't the point I wanted to make. So many of you who have watched older presentations or who have spoken to me over the years and know me well, know that I have a particular view of heaven and of the old earth. So I don't think they're that much different. That if we're not happy here, if we can't get on together, we won't be happy in heaven. We can express that idea, that concept, in different ways. And maybe a more palatable way to express it is that we're all on a journey. And some people are further along in their walk, in their relationship with God than others. But the flood comes whether you're ready or not, or how far along on your journey you are. And it's important for us to understand that we don't reach perfection in the way many Christians conceptualize what perfection looks like. This side of heaven. And again, I don't want to be misunderstood to suggest that sin enters into heaven. But the damage that we carry we speak about It's a phrase that we borrow from Ellen White, the house in which we live. When I say we carry this damage, in that phrase, I mean the we, I don't mean the house. We get new bodies, we all understand that. But the damage that sin has done to us, the inner person, is a phrase that we often use. Doesn't easily get erased. God does not have the ability, the power, the strength to fix that problem. Yes. God does not have the ability to fix that in the lifetime of human being, 70 years. It takes a long time for that damage to heal. And I'm sure we're all aware of it because we're mature within this movement in its concept and ideas. The purpose of creation is relationships. Human beings were designed, engineered to be the counterpart of God. We know that. So when I spoke about God not having the ability or the power to repair us, to fix us, in one lifetime, in addition to that, God can't heal us, repair us without our cooperation. I use the word cooperation, but it's not a very good word to use. Because it doesn't do justice to the enormity of the problem that confronts us and God. We all have a pretty good working definition of what sin is. In the King James, it defines sin in this way. To the person who knows to do good and doesn't do it, it is sin. So the idea there is that sin has to be based on an understanding of something, of information. If you don't have cognition, you cannot be held responsible. And if you're not held responsible, you're not doing sin. Now, that simple statement sounds easy because it's a Bible verse that we could all go to and quote. So this is an open-ended question, and you might see it differently to me. We're going to define sin in that way there's a big problem. What do you think that big problem would be? Anybody got any thoughts about why is it such a big problem if sin is defined based upon a person's knowledge? Christine?
That as an excuse not to try to learn something, because they figure, like, I don't know it and I can't be accused of it.
So Christine says there's this concept of being willingly ignorant. So you deliberately don't investigate things so that you can escape the accusation of the crime. Lena? Okay, so Lena said the same thing, that there's this concept of being willingly ignorant, deliberately covering your eyes and your ears so that you can escape investigation. Emmanuel?
I was having the same thought, and I was like, how about the one that didn't know? What did they know?
So Emmanuel had a similar thought. Anyone else? Bob?
Willing ignorance is still a choice.
Yes, so the idea is the problem, Bob said that willingly ignorance is still a choice. So we all know that you can't escape using that issue. Jackie? Okay, the same point. So what I want to suggest, after Lena gives her point.
In society, whatever, that because the group doesn't know what is that they're doing sin, and they're no intervention from somebody who knows better. This is sin, so the society virtually or a long time.
So Lena said, if no one in a community or society knows that sin is occurring, the sin perpetuates and it doesn't get sorted out. So I have a similar thought, which I'll share in a moment. So just remember what Lena said. Larry?
One could use that as a way to judge others. Some who are more knowledgeable could look at another group and say, judgment or be condescending because they don't know what they do.
So a problem with this idea of sin, because people have different understandings of a particular issue, we view the problem differently. And just introducing the idea of loving the sinner and hating the sin and I've hardly ever met anybody that doesn't fall foul of that issue, that doesn't fall into that trap. They end up hating the sinner as much as the sin. It opens the door to judging people. So, to me, what seems a real problem with this idea is that sin becomes subjective. It eradicates the idea of objective sin or absolute sin. It does away with the idea of sin being something that's absolute or objective. Because you can't apply the rules, the law, equally. It has to be applied individually. And they're the points, particularly that Lena and Larry brought forth. And I really want us to think how messy that is. And in the book of Hebrews, Paul addresses this issue after speaking about the superiority and the validity of Christ's ministry. Paul speaks about a new covenant. And does anybody know the argument that he makes when he says, the conclusion of the matter is we have such a high priest and there's going to be a new covenant. And then he says something that's really interesting, I think. Gloria. So Gloria says we have an intercessor, which is true, but he says something else. Anybody have a thought? Samaria.
That he says Christ is here once.
So Paul speaks about Christ entering once for all the sins, but he makes another point. This idea about individualism. So Paul says, and when I give you the sort of the paraphrase, you'll tell me the verse. So Paul says that in the new covenant, everybody who's in a new covenant relationship doesn't need to be taught by someone else, because they can learn about God themselves. And I've always wondered about that. If that were true at the surface, I'd be without a job. Who found the chapter and the verse? Okay, they're still looking. Hebrews 8. We've got chapter 8, verse 10. So let's just double check if that's correct.
8 is where it talks about the new covenant.
No, we're just double checking. So Kathy says 8:11, and it's 8:11. So it says that they shall not teach every person their neighbor. Say, know the Lord. Because everybody shall know me. For me, when I read this passage, he speaks about teaching, which is really about instructing. And the same people who teach, because who are the teachers in Israel? The priesthood. And who are the judges? The priesthood. So this idea of teaching, instruction cannot be separated from judgment. This idea of an individualized salvation, tailor-fitted for every single one of us, is problematic. And why is it problematic? Because those pesky iPhones enable this. So this whole idea of a subjective salvation for Noah and the children, where God will deal with each of them individually, not corporately, which agrees with Hebrews 8:11, is against everything that we spoke about yesterday and over the last few presentations. You have a challenge in front of you. Not to judge one another, to understand that salvation is an individual experience, that we'll all enter heaven at, we'll say at a different level or a different experience. And yet we all have to do it together because we can't do it on our own. So all of these competing theological issues are all a living reality for us here in this room. And just outside in the other room, where they're also eating, they have no idea about the reality of the great controversy and what it means and how it's affecting us. Did anybody want to say something or comment? Penny, did you want to say something? No? Jackie.
I'm thinking now because what an example in this contrast between over there and here. What is our responsibility?
So for people online, we're at a hotel conference room. It's early morning here, and the people in the other room are having their breakfast. They're just the regular guests. And Jackie spoke about the contrast and the responsibility that we have.
And I would like to have one more. And we ate with them this morning.
And what's interesting is not only the responsibility and the privilege, but just before the meeting, Jackie and others in this group were actually sitting with those same people and eating with them. And they had no idea of who we are or what we're about. Emmanuel.
So, but iPhone is there. With the profession. Are you trying to say that we are getting same information the same way? Like, if no one is having more understanding of the information, we all receive it in our phone. You do too, so we are like, and try to figure out on our own, and interpret it in our own way.
So Emmanuel was asking about the iPhone because I keep on going on about that. He was asking about what point I'm trying to make and what truth we should get from that. Of course, it's not about the phone itself. We all know that it's not the hardware, even the software. It's about the dream of the person who created this piece of equipment. Because they were seeking for the truth. We might say seeking for God. And the system, the corporate structure, let that person down. It failed them. And whatever hurt or pain it caused that person, they thought they could make a difference to others in a similar situation, to people in the world. People like us who had been let down by society. By the church, by the state, by those who have power. And this person's dream was to set us free. So even though I speak about it in a negative way, I want us to understand that the purpose of that was positive. But it has unintended consequences. Okay, so that was part of the summary of yesterday, the story of Noah and this journey that each of those people are on. And when we get to heaven, many of us are going there in a broken and damaged state. And the only way things get fixed is if we cooperate with God in the plan of salvation. One second, we've got an audio problem. Is it okay now? I used the word cooperation. I said it wasn't a very good word. We spoke about the definition of sin. that it's subjective and it cannot be fixed unless you know that you're doing sin, which is a point that someone brought up. I think it was Lena brought that up. Years ago, there were several studies that were done on the subject of understanding and wisdom. And who is wisdom? Penny? Sophia. Good. So some people remember those studies. And if the person is us, is me, we know that Sophia is someone else, an external agent. So we have to have understanding and wisdom. And I think I framed it in this very simplistic way. That wisdom is the correct application or usage of information or knowledge. So it's not enough just to know what sin is, then you need to have wisdom in how to behave properly. So the reason I like the story of Noah, there are many stories that we can glean from that, many lessons, and I've spoken about it many times in the past. Last time, when we spoke about Noah, that caused a bit of a storm. Because I spoke about how horrible God was. Building such a small boat. Even if you wanted salvation, you couldn't get it. There's just not enough space for everybody. What I found interesting about that conversation was how ready and how quickly, I'm going to say everybody, but that's sort of generic. How quick people were to defend God. God knew no one wanted to go on the ark, so God just made it the right size. People here are smiling when I just said that. But I think people actually believe it. They believe God made a small boat because God had foresight that no one wanted to get on anyway, so why waste the wood? I'm not so sure, to be honest. So, sorry, I didn't catch your name. Eva. Eva said, is that predestination? So I'm going to say the simple answer, yes, I believe it is. I don't infer that that's a dirty word when it comes to God. But if you're not careful, it can get pretty ugly. And I don't know what Eva thinks about it, but I'm not too inclined to go down the path of predestination, because I don't think it's a very good theology or a doctrine to hold on to. It's really problematic. For me, I'd rather serve a God that was ignorant rather than one that used predestination to work things out. Okay, so I've got a couple of hands up. The only reason I mentioned that story is because today's story about Noah is completely different and I think much more positive. Go ahead.
Hearing in the past in the Adventist church that was not.
Okay, so even I guess he's like me, she doesn't like the concept or the theology of predestination. Is that right?
Because it was taught that God is not predestined for people to get lost.
Yeah, because God doesn't predestine people to be lost or saved.
It was predestination.
Kristen, did you have your hand up?
And how does God know the end from the beginning?
So the question then becomes, how does God know the end from the beginning? I'm not going to answer that question, but I want to pose another one, and I'm not expecting an answer. How does Satan know the end from the beginning? Because Satan's pretty good at it as well. So that's just a sort of a throwaway question. I need to respond. Emmanuel?
Because they know God. Because they know God.
Because who knows God?
Satan knows God.
Oh, so Emmanuel said because Satan knows God. That's how. But if we were to use that argument, then we'd say God knows us. So that's how God knows the end from the beginning. And I think that's a stronger argument than it sounds the way I've just expressed it. It's a much more powerful one argument. Donna.
I was just commenting about Eva's predestination, and I just wanted to say that it was predestination or free will. That was the choice in the argument between the Calvinists and
So Donna is taking us back to the Arminian and the Calvinist struggle. And there's this theological tension. It's throughout choice. So she was just commenting on the point that Eva had made originally about predestination. And why Adventists don't agree with predestination. Yeah. Samaria?
I was bring up one more time about how the Satan program, and I remember elders take out the or they don't.
how they have to like study as we do. It was in the context of, I think, the death of the kings of the north, how that's not actually the case, but how we thought they used to be, and Satan did as well. So they don't really know the end. They're not full.
So Samaria is saying that based upon what someone said, we won't mention their name, that Satan doesn't really know the future. Just as Emmanuel said, Satan's just very clever, which is not what God is. God's not clever, God just knows. That's the point you're making, I think, Samaria, is it? That's the difference.
Yeah.
Because that's what Samaria's recollection of the argument that was used by that person, that teacher. So I don't want to get into a theological debate about this subject. But I do have to say that the agents that God uses aren't very good ones. Because if God was so knowledgeable, God tends to give us people who make really bad mistakes, damaging ones. If God is so knowledgeable about the future, God has a habit or a reputation of picking bad agents. Who are very prone to sending you in the wrong direction. We spoke about churches number 5 and 7 yesterday. You can blame the membership all you want, but who are the real criminals? Who are the ones that misdirected those churches? We can say prophets and not name them, the unnamed prophets, if we want. But if you want to be real, we can put some names to them. I think that's either 2018-19. Which one? Which year? I'm asking my translator, which year? Oh, you can't remember. No. So back in France, there was a school of the prophets in 18 or 19 where we identified who those bad people were. The angel of Sardis is Miller. And it's his prejudices, his bad theology that sends Sardis into a zombie, turns it into a zombie church. Later series confronted with the same issue. What's the Bible verse? Without time, the people perish. Good. That's not a real Bible verse, by the way. I made that one up. But it's true. She was so fixated about the issue of time. Her message, her theology took the church into Laodicea. I hope we're all mature enough when I say God is so omnipotent, had such power. Wouldn't he choose better prophets? Because the reason why this movement is still struggling, but why a movement is needed, it's not just to combat Moses. Our biggest problem is Ellen White. Our struggle with end-time prophecy is all about analyzing, viewing, and dismantling what she has said. And to do that properly is a difficult and a dangerous task. Okay, a couple of more questions, because I've made this digress and I apologize. Phil.
No.
Oh, no. Oh, sorry, I thought you had your hand up. Anyone else? Manuel.
Why do people perish without a time? Why do people perish when there's no time?
So the question is, why do people perish when there's no time? Because it was wrong. We've demonstrated and proven that time continued to be the key to unlock end-time prophecy. We've demonstrated that as a movement. At least in my mind, that's how I understand things. They had a prophet. I'll give a random date because I'm not very good at dates. From 1848 onwards, that instructed the church that they should ignore time. And what should she have really been doing? Obviously focusing on time, but what have they forgotten? What they rejected? The 2520. Because come 1863, as the 2520 comes to its conclusion, they're just going to destroy that. That's why I say without time, the people perished. This movement is created upon time, as we know. Because every Adventist knows that we're living at the end of the world. But that's a stretchy term because nobody actually knows what that means. And most of you, if you like most people in this movement, are asking the question, when is the Sunday law? Because you're looking for another marker. Which is time. Without time, we perish. So that's all I wanted to say about that point. Okay, so we've done, I think, a fair summary, at least partially, of what we discussed yesterday. We spoke about the concept of shaking. And we tried to have a better understanding of what the components or the structure of a shaking looked like, what it was. And you'll remember all these shakings here. Yes, yesterday we said the most important one was this one, 2021 France. Or did we say it was the least important? You can't hear my translator laughing. So, we spoke about the concept of shaking. And the place I wanted to bring us to which is only a temporary stop, which we've been discussing or leading to for many months now, is to consider the question, are we in a shaking at the moment? And if without some careful consideration, it's too easy to say we're not. Because it doesn't appear to have, the situation that we're in doesn't appear to have the same dynamic or characteristics as all of these. Because people aren't leaving, there's no split, there's no separation. So I'm going to suggest we came to a conclusion or an agreement without defining what the issues are, what the doctrine. We've got a few here, but the point I'm making is not that this is the definition of what's causing the shaking. I think we agreed that we're in a shaking. And someone used the idea that it's more individual. And I introduced the idea of people being here in body, but not in spirit. And if you incorporate that facet to a shaking, then we have all the characteristics of a crisis or a shaking in our present history. That people are separating one from another, aided and abetted by the events that have occurred over the last several years or even the last few decades. We mentioned two. We mentioned the new gurus. And we mentioned COVID and the lockdowns that were associated with it. So if we're in a shaking, and individuals aren't leaving, but they're not with us in spirit, in mind, without perhaps focusing on these issues, maybe we can't do it without focusing on them, but if we can, let's try. Why are they, or you, not leaving? What keeps you here? If you're distracted, if you don't agree, if you're not sure, why are you staying? Or your neighbor, if that's who you're thinking about. So I'd like some thoughts. Do you know anybody that fits into this? A friend? A child? A sibling? Parent? And of course, a spouse. So you have different people, different relationships that you have with people, but you know them well. Do you know people that fit into that category? And if you do, why do you think they're just not saying, I'm going, you carry on, I'll do something else? Why are they sort of staying, but they're not really participating, they're not really joining us or joining you? Alison.
Think about, the individual need not to go. Where do they go? I mean, going back to corporate athletes, they know better, I think, I'm assuming. If there's nothing there, then they've come this far in this movement for so long, they've got friends who are comfortable here, just to not agree with those three things up there in a time that you're in. For whatever reason, whatever's going on in their lives. But they feel like we're people, they don't want to go into the world, they want to how bad that is, they want to back to the church, they don't have to bear them.
So Alison has said, the reason they're not leaving is because they've got nowhere to go. They've got no viable, meaningful alternative. And that's a difference today compared to all of these other ones. All of the people that left in these histories, they felt so strongly about something they had an idea that was strong enough to carry them out of the movement. And this person here today, the one that Alison has described, doesn't have that. They don't have an alternative ideology or theology. for them to be able to stand up and walk on their own path. So they're stuck here. Alyssa.
Fear of death.
So Alyssa says they're afraid or they have a fear of death. There was a fear of death, but their fear was if they remain, they will die. So the accusation of death or being a murderer was leveled at us. So we go to say to 2019, they split from us, they separate from us, because if they remain, they will die. But Alyssa said that these people feel that if they leave, they will die. If I understood you correctly. So if that's true, if you leave, you die. I understand the idea of staying. Then why not the spiritual engagement? Why the disconnect spiritually? What's your argument to say they're staying in body because they're afraid of death, but if they stay here, not in spirit, it's a death sentence anyway. They know that. So, oh no, you carry on.
The thing that comes to mind is that in their minds they've struggled with points and not feeling heard, and so they've just stopped engaging. And
so these people that Alyssa's speaking about, don't actually agree with what we believe, and they don't feel heard. Is that what you've just said?
yeah, but now I'm seeing it differently.
I'll give you a moment to get your thoughts together. Aaron.
I think if you're still here after 2021, that means you've signed up to all the logic of gender equality.
So we've got 2021 here, but this is not a timeline in its normal sense. So Aaron said, if you've got past 2021, so he's turned that into a waymark. Then you have agreed, you've bought into, you've accepted, agreed, bought into, accepted. The logic of this movement. The premise upon which it's constructed. And?
As the years go by, if you realize it's not very exciting or you don't like it because you're sexist, homophobic, then you're going to have to physically leave because you're going to have to say, I'm sexist, so I'm leaving. And that's shameful. If you compare it to race, a lot of people that are racist, they go, I'm not racist, but I don't you know, I don't want to whatever, mix with some other race. So they know it's shameful.
So Aaron has given a couple of examples. Race and gender, I think, the ones that you spoke of.
So gender's not an example, it's the real thing. So compare it to race.
So he spoke about, I'm just going to say gender and race. And he said they don't leave because of peer pressure or social pressure. And peer pressure is being different to those around you, and the embarrassment that's attached to that. So you can agree with all of the logic that brings you to 2021. But it says fundamentally, you have some disagreement with the truth that this message portrays. That you're sexist or you're racist. But you're embarrassed to make that known because it's not culturally acceptable. Aaron?
And then the next step is, with this test, it's so easy to lie to yourself. That, like I say, I'm not racist, but you can say I'm not sexist, but it's not a very interesting message. It's too easy to kid yourself.
So Aaron said, which is a phrase that I, and I'm sure that all of you, hear very often. And it normally comes from men. Normally comes from husbands. And their first statement, not literally, is this: I'm not sexist. I know they are over there somewhere, but not me. I find it interesting when people say that. For two reasons. One of it is people feel defensive to make that statement. And the second thing, women, I never hear women say that. I'm not sexist. Because I think many women are in their own way, their own sphere of influence, as sexist, as patriarchal as men are, but they never speak about it that way. Okay. I hope I portrayed those thoughts accurately. By the way, what was 2021?
Radical feminism. And get married.
So this is the waymark that Aaron wanted to create there, or mark. And I asked him what that waymark was, and he said it was radical feminism, and
Gay marriage.
I call it same-sex marriage. So once you get to this year, with all the logic that's built up, it's very difficult to argue against it. people have got nowhere to go. They're either, in this context, we'll say that they're sexist, but they don't want to verbalize it. Probably because of embarrassment or shame. Any other thoughts? Why don't you just go? Bob?
I think there's a very dangerous and subtle situation where people they think by power of association to the movement, and yet they can hold on to and appease themselves with having this individual mentality that they're able to have their own connection with God that way, but they're still part of the movement, and it's a kind of self-deception.
Okay, so Bob says there's a self-deception going on. There's some peace. There's the peace and comfort of being associated or being part of this movement. Lily has brought up this idea of being dependent upon somebody. And several months ago, an article was posted on the movement forums speaking about middle-aged women who had been lied and cheated to. The patriarchal system had promised them freedom, but it actually enslaved them. And that had happened decades ago in their lives. They had sacrificed, or as Aaron said, they agreed with the logic they come to a point in their experience, in their marriage, and they want out a divorce, but they can't because they're tied, they're locked into their marriages because of financial dependency. So that's a real phenomena. And in that example, Lily has helped us to see both literally and symbolically or spiritually why people remain. Not so easy to go. And sometimes you've got nowhere to go to. Okay.
So, I am trying to think about this, why the person stay here and they don't leave. It's because each one of us has a brain and you need to have certain explanation. So when a question like this comes up, it is probably that they need more information to understand. That's why they are staying here. So it's not that they deny, but they still need more.
So Christina has suggested something similar to what Alyssa was saying earlier on. It's not that people have rejected the truth or information, it's just they don't understand. And they're waiting for some decent person to make the effort to explain things to them in a way that they can understand. So they understand all the logic that brings us to this place. But they still have questions which aren't getting answered. So I know people still wanted to make a response to some of the points we've already done, but I just want to move on a little bit. Does anybody here feel either disenfranchised? Disenfranchised means that then they don't feel part of the group. They're not part of the structure. And they have opinions or questions which are problematic. And do you feel afraid to ask these questions? Because we'll all turn around and say, how dare you ask things like that? You're so sexist. So I don't know if Christina was talking about someone she knows. But the point she brings up, I come across all the time. And it's often from men who say, I've got this question, but I can't ask it. I'm being cancelled. Because this movement's got a cancel culture. They may not use that phrase, but that's what's going on. So put your hands up if you feel like that. I've got this really awkward question, and if I asked it, people would look down upon me. So I then ask. So I just have to bide my time. So only one person put their hand up. I can't believe it's only one person. 2 people, 3. Oh, so we've got a few people in our group who have questions which they know are antagonistic to what we profess to believe. But they rather would not ask the question. Because I would say to them, are you serious? After all this logic to 2021, you're still not on board. Or worse, we'll get out the bludgeon, which is like a big hammer. On May 2nd, 2022, I was going to say Ellen White, Elder Tess said that, and you're telling me you're against that? Because once you do that, what can you say? You're cancelled. So I think it's a really legitimate point. And I'm really sad for a number of things. One, that so few of you were brave enough to put your hands up. That even if it is just a few of you, that California has this culture amongst yourselves. You're not uniquely bad because it's everywhere, by the way. And whilst we have a leader who defines doctrine, that we use that person's words to silence people. Because, sorry? I've already forgotten what I said. Sorry, I'm having a conversation with my translator, a private one here. I have no idea what I said.
Other people use your words against
Oh, okay.
the opposite to you.
So, I don't know Elder Test that well. Maybe better than most people, of course. But I know myself pretty well. And I do know that when you stand up before God's people, what you see is a one-dimensional figure. You might say two-dimensional. And in another context, in another conversation, I could say something quite different. So I like to caution people to be careful about quoting prophets. If you're willing to call Elder Tess a prophet, and I am, because both we and they have a history. We only mentioned 2 prophets before, but I could mention a lot more that have baggage. That are easily misunderstood. The words are taken out of context. And it becomes difficult if you put them on a pedestal and use them as the definitive marker for what's right and what's wrong. Because it stops personal growth. And I've touched on it very lightly, especially through this year. But I think people have a misunderstanding on the role of certain individuals. And how they operate, how they manage their public persona, their public message. If I were to tell you, I know this leading person in the movement who says if you eat meat and you're a leader in the movement, you should be removed. You might say, that's fair enough. You might even say, of course. But if I then told you that that same person wrote a message to one of their relatives and said, when you come and visit next week, don't forget to bring the salmon, because it's my favorite thing. Now, I don't know how you would view that situation. If you would see it as hypocrisy, apostasy, what? Because if you challenge the person, say, you hypocrite. You turn him into a vegan and look what you do. And they said, you misunderstood me. When I said you're not allowed to eat meat, I thought everybody knew what meat was. Because fish is not meat. Meat, everybody knows, is a land animal. So there's no fowl. Everything's good. So I don't know what you would think about that dynamic. The circumstantial, is there something circumstantial going on? All I know is that that's Ellen White. And not everybody knows that. So the point I wanted to make in that, I may have changed the names and it's like that, but it's a real situation. It was really Ellen White. And if only that changes your view of salmon or not. I think it was actually mackerel in real life, but I changed the name. Not to blame, because I don't want to accuse mackerels of anything wrong. So the point of me, does that change your view on Ellen White, prophets, what her writings say, veganism? I don't know if it changes how you view things. Prophets are necessary just because God said that they are. But I think we really need to be careful how we handle them. Both the dead and the living ones. Because if you don't, you end up getting this dynamic, this situation where we're not able to express our concerns, our doubts, our worries. We can't ask our questions. Susan, sorry, you had your hand up a long time ago.
I lost that thought.
I'm sorry.
No.
Okay. Does anybody have any comment or thought or question? Victoria.
Based on what you
said that.
Okay, so I'll swing back in a minute. Emmanuel.
Are you saying that, this is my just thought, that the prophet, their message is encoding, need to be decoded. So when you are talking to a prophet, you need to decode the message they're saying before you even like get into it and use it.
So Emmanuel has spoken about coding and encoding or decoding a message. And a term that we often use in this movement, because we don't really talk about coding, is sifting. Sift your sources. That's what they tell me to do. Sift your sources. And my response is, I would if I knew how to. Because I have no idea how to sift sources. Victoria, did you remember your point?
I'm not a one member about my questions or concerns. I just want to put out that I understand that that there is kind of that culture a little bit, but it doesn't make me scared to voice what I have to say.
Okay, so Victoria says she has empathy about what we've just said about this idea of not being able to speak or question. But she's able to express her concerns or questions privately, individually to people that she knows. Yeah, people in the movement, of course. Okay, so I need to stop. Yes, I was thinking the same. I thought I was at the 1 hour mark. I'm approaching the 2 hour mark. I'm sorry. Okay, so before we close, put your hands up if you're afraid. No, if you're, yeah, put your hands up if you're afraid to say the following. I don't agree with everything that Ellen White taught. Are you afraid to say that? So that most people are comfortable to say, I don't agree with everything Ellen White said. So Alyssa, you're afraid to say that?
It doesn't stop me, but I'm afraid, yeah.
Okay, I'm going to use afraid to stop in that.
So do I have fear that stops me from saying that Ellen White is wrong? Yeah, sometimes.
So you're afraid to say, Ellen White was wrong about the Sunday law. You're afraid to express that idea?
To certain people at certain times,
You're afraid of them or afraid of the truth?
the backlash.
Okay, but I'm not talking about afraid what people will do with it, but are you afraid to actually say what you think about Ellen White? It's about you and Ellen White. No. Anyone else? Okay, so no one's afraid. Put your hands up if you're afraid to disagree with Elder Tess publicly. Okay, so you could, if I could show you the camera here, all the hands shot up. So people here are afraid to disagree with Elder Tess, but they're not afraid to disagree with Ellen White. And we'll close on that point, or I get into more trouble. Let's pray. Holy God, we thank you for your mercy and your goodness. As we grapple with our own humanity, as we wrestle with other people's humanity and how it affects us, as we consider how fearful we are of what people think, how we project those fears upon you, God, I want to thank you for myself and on behalf of others, that however much I misuse you, that I misunderstand you, that perhaps sometimes people might not even like you, your faithfulness towards each and every one of us is unfailing. And unlike me, you never cease to do good. In Jesus' name, amen.